Imagine standing at the edge of a forest, at the moment between dusk and full dark. The trees are ancient, their trunks wider than you can wrap your arms around. Moss covers their roots in thick green silence. The last light of the sun has bled out somewhere behind the hills, and the forest before you breathes with a cold, living darkness. You hear something, not wind, not an animal, something deeper than either. A low rhythmic pulse, like a drumbeat from somewhere beneath the earth itself. Like the heartbeat of something vast and old and entirely unconcerned with you. And then you see him. He sits at the base of the oldest tree, perfectly still, legs folded beneath him, as if he has been seated there since the beginning of the world. He is a man, and he is not a man. Antlers rise from his head, branching into the dark canopy above him, each point catching what little light remains in the sky like silver stars embedded in bone. Around him, the animals have gathered. A great stag stands at his right hand, breath steaming in the cold air. A wolf sits at his left, amber eyes unblinking. Serpents coil at his feet, slow and heavy, their scales catching the dying light. And all of them, every one of them, is oriented toward him, watching him, waiting. In one hand, he holds a torque, a twisted ring of ancient gold, the kind of thing that kings gave to warriors who had earned it in blood. In his other hand, coiling upward toward him as if in devotion, a serpent with the head of a ram, a creature that should not exist, a creature that belongs to no taxonomy we have ever written down. He turns his gaze toward you. His eyes are not human eyes. They are the eyes of everything wild, everything untamed, everything that existed before cities and laws, and the careful, anxious ordering of the world. They are the eyes of the forest itself, looking back at you. This is Cernunnos, the horned one, lord of the wild, master of animals, god of the threshold between civilization and the dark. And here is what almost no one tells you. We barely know anything about him. After 3,000 years of worship stretching across the entire Celtic world, after his image was carved into stone and hammered into silver and cast in bronze, and perhaps woven into stories told around fires that have been cold for 2 millennia. After he was feared enough that an entire civilization transformed him into the image of the devil himself, we have recovered exactly one inscription bearing his name. One, and yet Cernunnos may be the most ancient deity in the entire Western tradition. Older than the Olympians, older than the Norse Aesir, older, perhaps, than civilization itself. Tonight we descend into the oldest darkness there is. Not the darkness of the tomb, not the darkness of the underworld with its named rivers and its careful geography, but the original darkness, the darkness of the forest at the edge of the firelight, the darkness that our ancestors stared into every night for 100,000 years, knowing that something looked back. We will trace Cernunnos from the cave walls of the Paleolithic to the demonology of the medieval church. From the sacred groves, where Druids performed rites that no Roman ever witnessed, to the modern altars, where people still invoke his name, we will ask how a god so ancient and so powerful that his image survived the death of his entire civilization came to be forgotten. And we will ask something even more unsettling. What does it mean that he is coming back? Like the god himself, this story has three faces. The face of his origins, reaching back into the deepest past we can access. The face of his suppression, when the most powerful forces in the Western world tried to bury him permanently. And the face of his endurance, which tells us something profound about the parts of human nature that cannot be civilized away. Let us begin in the dark. To understand Cernunnos, we must begin in a cave. Not metaphorically, literally. We must travel to the cavern des Trois Frères, in what is now the arid region of southern France. And we must go back approximately 15,000 years to the end of the last ice age, when the people of Europe were not farmers or city builders, but hunters, living in small bands, following the great migrations of animals across a landscape that looked nothing like the Europe of today. On the walls of that cave, among extraordinary paintings of horses, bison, mammoths, and bears that those Paleolithic artists left behind, there is a figure that has stopped every scholar who encounters it cold for over a century. It is called the sorcerer. It stands in an elevated position above the other animal paintings, as if presiding over them. It is a composite being, partly human and partly animal. It has the ears of a stag, the antlers of a reindeer, the eyes of an owl, the paws of a bear, the tail of a horse, or possibly a wolf. It stands upright in a posture that combines human alertness with animal readiness. Whether this painted figure represents a deity, a shaman in the act of ritual transformation, a mythological being, or something we have no modern category to describe, scholars have argued about for generations. There is no consensus. What is beyond argument is this: 15,000 years ago, human beings in Europe were already creating images of a figure that combined human and animal forms, specifically featuring antlers, and placing that figure in a position of power and authority over the natural world. The sorcerer of Trois Frères is not Cernunnos. The cultural gap between them is too vast, the temporal distance too enormous for us to draw a straight line from one to the other. But the sorcerer represents something. It represents a concept so ancient, so deeply embedded in the human relationship with the natural world, that it appears in recognizable form across tens of thousands of years. The idea of the master of animals, the concept that somewhere beyond the ordinary world there exists a being who is simultaneously predator and prey, hunter and hunted, human and beast. A being who stands at the boundary between the human world and the wild world, who governs the movement of game through the forest, who must be propitiated before the hunt and honored after it, upon whose goodwill the survival of the tribe literally depends. This concept is not uniquely European. It appears in shamanic traditions across Siberia, the Americas, Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. The master of animals is one of humanity's oldest and most widespread religious ideas. It seems to emerge wherever human beings live in close relationship with the animal world, wherever hunting is the difference between life and death. In Western Europe, that ancient concept would eventually crystallize over many thousands of years and through many cultural transformations into the figure we now call Cernunnos. But to get there, we must understand the world that gave him his specific form. We must understand the Celts. The term Celtic is a modern scholarly category, not one that the ancient peoples would have used for themselves. What archaeologists and linguists identify as Celtic cultures emerged in Central Europe during the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, roughly between 1200 and 600 BCE. Over the following centuries, Celtic-speaking peoples spread across an enormous territory, from Anatolia in the east to Ireland in the west, from northern Spain through Gaul into Britain and beyond. At their height, Celtic cultures dominated most of Europe north of the Mediterranean world. These were not primitive peoples. The stereotype of the wild Celtic barbarian, largely invented by Greek and Roman writers, who had excellent political reasons to emphasize Celtic ferocity and irrationality, has been thoroughly dismantled by modern archaeology. The Celts were sophisticated metallurgists, producing ironwork and goldwork of extraordinary quality. They were skilled farmers and herders. They were gifted artists whose Latin style, with its flowing curvilinear forms and intricate interlocking designs, is among the most beautiful and distinctive artistic production of the ancient world. They maintained complex social hierarchies with elaborate codes of honor, hospitality, and obligation. They traded across vast distances. Celtic goods have been found in the Mediterranean world, and Mediterranean luxury items appear in Celtic graves in Central Europe. This was not isolation. This was confident cultural engagement. But the Celts had one characteristic that has made them extraordinarily difficult for later scholars to understand. They did not write their sacred knowledge down, not because they were illiterate. Some Celtic peoples, particularly those in contact with Mediterranean culture, could read and write using alphabets borrowed or adapted from Greek and Latin scripts. Gaulish inscriptions exist. Celtic peoples used writing for practical purposes, for inscriptions on dedications, for marking ownership, for recording transactions. But the Druidic class, the religious and intellectual elite of Celtic society, made a deliberate and principled choice to preserve their sacred knowledge exclusively through oral transmission. Julius Caesar, who spent years fighting the Gauls and paid careful attention to their social and religious organization, noted this in his account of the Gallic Wars. He wrote that the Druids considered it sacrilegious to commit their teachings to writing, believing that the act of writing down sacred knowledge would make it accessible to the unworthy, and that reliance on written texts would weaken the trained memory on which their entire intellectual tradition depended. This was not ignorance. This was a philosophy with catastrophic consequences for everyone who came after. The religious life of the Celts, their creation myths, their cosmology, their understanding of the divine, their stories about their gods and heroes, their ritual practices, their theology, all of it was carried in living memory. It was spoken, recited, sung, performed. It lived in the minds of trained specialists who spent years, sometimes decades, memorizing and preserving it. And when the chain of transmission broke, when Roman conquest dismantled the social structures of Gaulish society, when cultural assimilation eroded Celtic identity across continental Europe, when Christian conversion eventually reached even the most remote corners of the British Isles, and fundamentally transformed the intellectual class that had maintained Celtic learning, most of it simply vanished. The mythology of the Celts, one of the most sophisticated and ancient religious traditions in European history, is gone. We have fragments, shadows, echoes. What we have left falls into three categories. First, archaeological evidence. Objects, structures, sites, inscriptions, and images that the Celts left in the ground. These give us invaluable information about what they made, where they worshipped, what symbols they used, and sometimes the names of their deities. But objects cannot explain themselves. They give us the what without the why. Second, outside observations. Primarily Greek and Roman writers, men like Caesar, Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, Pomponius Mela, and Tacitus, who wrote about Celtic religion from the perspective of outside observers. These accounts are invaluable because they are contemporary, but they are also profoundly limited. These writers were describing a foreign religion through the lens of their own cultural assumptions, usually with political motivations that colored their accounts. The Romans had excellent reasons to depict the Gauls and Britons as barbarians, whose practices were primitive or monstrous. You read Caesar's description of the Druids, knowing that he was also writing a justification for his conquest. Third, later literary traditions, primarily from Ireland and Wales, where elements of pre-Christian mythology were eventually written down in the early medieval period after the conversion by Christian monks who were often genuinely interested in preserving ancient learning, but who inevitably filtered it through their own worldview. The Irish mythological cycles and the Welsh Mabinogion contain ancient material, but that material has been transformed by centuries of oral transmission and by the deliberate or unconscious reframing of Christian scholarship. None of these sources gives us direct access to what the continental Celts believed about their gods. This is the fundamental problem with Cernunnos. He was, by all visual evidence, one of the most important deities in the Celtic world. His image appears across an enormous geographic and temporal range, and we have almost no textual evidence that explains who he was, what mythology surrounded him, what specific powers he wielded, or how his worship was conducted. We are reconstructing a god from portraits. And yet, those portraits are extraordinary. The name Cernunnos appears exactly once in the ancient record, and the circumstances of its discovery are themselves remarkable. In 1710, during construction work beneath the medieval cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris, workers uncovered a massive stone pillar buried deep in the earth. The pillar dated to the early 1st century of the Common Era. It had been erected by the Guild of Boatmen of Lutetia, which was the Roman name for the Celtic settlement on the island in the Seine that would eventually become Paris. The city was the capital of the Celtic Parisii tribe, and even after Roman conquest, it retained a strong Celtic cultural character. The pillar, now known as the Pillar of the Boatmen, is decorated with carvings of multiple divine figures, some Roman, some clearly Celtic. Among them is a figure depicted with antlers rising from his head. Above this figure, an inscription reads, Cernunnos, beneath the most famous cathedral in France, built on the sacred island of a Celtic tribe. The god had hidden himself in stone for 1700 years. That is the entirety of our direct textual evidence for his name. But the visual evidence is astonishing in its richness and its consistency. The Gundestrup Cauldron is perhaps the single most spectacular object to survive from the ancient Celtic world. Discovered in 1891 in a peat bog in Jutland, Denmark, it is a large silver vessel, 69 centimeters in diameter, decorated inside and outside with a series of embossed panels depicting divine figures, ritual scenes, mythological imagery, and processions of warriors and animals. The interior panel that interests us most shows a figure seated in a cross-legged posture at the center of a composition teeming with life. He wears a torque around his neck. He holds a torque in his right hand, displayed or offered outward. In his left hand, a serpent with a ram's head coils upward toward him. Antlers rise from his head, branching above him into the composition. To his right, a great stag stands. Around and below him, other animals orient themselves toward his seated form. He is the center. The animals arrange themselves around him as if held in place by his presence. This figure was found in Denmark, far from the Celtic heartland on the continent, demonstrating that Cernunnos imagery had spread across an enormous territory, carried by trade, migration, and the movement of ideas across the Celtic world. Other representations have been found across Gaul, Britain, northern Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula. Antlered deity figures appear on coins, on carved stone reliefs, on small bronze figurines, on decorated vessels. They span several centuries of Celtic artistic production. Some are clearly high-status religious objects. Others seem to have been personal devotional items. All of them participate in the same visual language. What is consistent across virtually all of these representations is a cluster of associated symbols and themes. The antlers, almost always. The seated posture, frequently. The accompanying animals, particularly stags and serpents. The torque, either worn or held. The theme of presiding over or commanding the animal world. The sense of abundance, of life in its fullest and most fecund expression. What do these elements tell us about who Cernunnos was? Let us work through them carefully, because the imagery is our primary evidence. In the modern world, antlers are biological objects. Remarkable ones, certainly, but biological. We understand them through the lens of evolutionary biology and natural history. In the ancient Celtic world, antlers were cosmological objects. The stag was the most symbolically charged animal in the Celtic imagination. Its image appears in Celtic art more frequently than almost any other creature. The word for stag appears as a root in Celtic place names, personal names, and tribal designations across the entire Celtic-speaking world. The stag runs through Celtic mythology in the fragments that survive, always as a creature of power, mystery, and threshold crossing. To understand why, you need to set aside the modern view of deer as gentle herbivores and understand what a great stag represented to a Celtic hunter. The stag was the most magnificent animal in the European forest. During the rut, when the males engaged in their spectacular battles of antler and voice, it was also one of the most dangerous. A wounded stag in its prime could kill a man. Hunting it required skill, courage, knowledge of the forest, and something more. Something the Celts would have understood as spiritual alignment, as the favor of the powers that governed the wild. But the stag was also the prey animal par excellence, the creature whose flesh fed the tribe, whose hide provided warmth, whose antlers became tools, decorations, ritual objects. The stag gave everything when it died. This combination, supreme power and supreme sacrifice, the hunter's greatest challenge and the hunter's greatest gift, placed the stag at the center of the Celtic symbolic universe, and the antlers were the most charged element of all. Consider what antlers do from the perspective of someone who has no concept of biology, who understands the world through patterns of power and meaning, rather than through mechanisms of genetics and hormones. Each year, the stag sheds its antlers. The previous year's crown, the symbol of its status and power, falls away. For a period, the stag stands without them, diminished, seemingly vulnerable. And then they grow back, faster than anything else in nature grows. Within months, a new crown has emerged, hardened, and reached full glory, often larger than the year before. Death and rebirth, enacted every year in bone growing from the head of a living creature. For a people who lived intimately with the natural world, who tracked the seasons through the behavior of animals, who understood time as a cycle of death and renewal, rather than a line moving toward an end. This annual drama of the antlers was not merely interesting, it was revelatory. It demonstrated the fundamental principle of existence, that death is not an ending, but a transformation, that what falls away is replaced, that the cycle continues. For Cernunnos to wear antlers permanently, to carry this sign of seasonal death and rebirth as a fixed crown, was to claim more than just association with deer. It was to claim dominion over the principle itself. He does not lose his antlers and regrow them because he embodies the cycle from outside it. He is the still center around which the wheel of death and rebirth turns. The seated posture of so many Cernunnos images deepens this reading. The cross-legged position is not passive. It is the posture of a being who does not need to move because everything moves around him. He is rooted. He is grounded. He sits at the axis of the wild world, and the wild world arranges itself around him. The animals gathered in his vicinity tell us about the different domains over which he presides. The stag represents the forest, the hunt, the cycle of seasons. The serpent connects him to chthonic power, to the earth below, and what moves between the surface world and the world beneath. The wolf, when it appears, represents the predator, the darkness at the edge of the firelight, the wild in its most dangerous and uncompromising form. Cernunnos seated calmly, while a wolf sits at his side, suggests his authority extends even over the forces that threaten human life. The ram-headed serpent on the Gundestrup Cauldron is particularly fascinating because it is clearly a mythological creature, not a natural one. No such animal exists. Its combination of serpent body with ram's head may combine the chthonic symbolism of the snake with the fertility and power symbolism of the ram, creating a creature of doubled meaning, doubly connected to both the earth below and the abundance of the living world above. The torque he wears and holds is a marker of his role as distributor of abundance. In Celtic society, the gift of a torque was a transformative act. When a chieftain gave a torque to a warrior, he was changing that warrior's status, incorporating him into a network of obligation and honor. For Cernunnos to hold a torque in his outstretched hand was to display his role as the one who grants, who opens the forest's abundance to those who have earned or requested it. Taken together, these elements build a portrait of a deity who presides over the entirety of the natural world in its untamed state, who governs the hunt, who holds the cycle of life and death in his hands, who distributes the forest's gifts and withholds them, who commands both the noble and the fearsome aspects of the wild, and who exists in a space between the human world and whatever lies beyond it. We cannot speak of Cernunnos without speaking of the Druids, because it is within the Druidic religious tradition that he would have been understood and honored. The Druids have been subjected to more romantic fantasy, more Victorian invention, and more modern appropriation than almost any other religious class in history. The white-robed, wise men of popular imagination, cutting mistletoe with golden sickles at Stonehenge under the full moon, are largely a creation of 18th century antiquarianism mixed with wishful thinking. Stonehenge predates Celtic culture by 1,000 years or more. The actual Druids were something both more ordinary and more extraordinary than the romantic image. They were the intellectual elite of Celtic society, a trained class that combined the functions of priest, judge, philosopher, historian, and poet. They underwent training that ancient accounts say lasted up to 20 years. They were responsible for maintaining the vast body of sacred and legal knowledge that kept Celtic society functioning. They officiated at religious ceremonies, adjudicated legal disputes, educated the children of the nobility, preserved genealogies and histories, and served as intermediaries between the human world and the divine. They commanded enormous authority. According to Caesar, a Druid could not be tried by any authority outside the Druidic order, regardless of the crime. They moved freely between warring tribes. When they raised their hands between two armies, the fighting stopped. Their religious practices centered heavily on the natural world. The word Druid itself is often interpreted as meaning something like oakwise or forest knower, connecting them etymologically to the sacred forest. Classical sources consistently describe Druidic ritual as taking place in sacred groves, what the Romans called nemeton, a Celtic word that survives in place names across the old Celtic world. These nemeton were not temples in the Mediterranean sense. They were not enclosed buildings with statues inside. They were clearings in the forest, enclosed by ancient trees, where the boundary between the human world and the divine world was understood to be thin. The trees themselves were sacred. The grove was the temple. This location tells us something crucial about Celtic religion generally, and about Cernunnos specifically. For the Celts, the divine was not primarily located in human-made structures. It was located in the natural world. The sacred was not something brought into a building and kept there. It was something found and encountered in wild places. Cernunnos, as Lord of the Wild, as the deity whose domain was precisely the forest and its untamed abundance, would have been particularly at home in the nemeton. Not brought there, already there, resident in the ancient wood, in the movements of the animals, in the darkness beneath the canopy. The Druids had names for his powers that we have lost. They had stories about his origins that were never written. They had rituals for approaching him that died with the last practitioners. What we can reconstruct from imagery and from analogy with related traditions is a broad outline. He was approached with respect and with acknowledgement, not as a petition to a distant ruler, but as a relationship with a present power. The hunter who entered the forest was entering his domain. The farmer whose fields bordered the wood was neighbor to his territory. The passage between the two worlds required recognition, required the correct protocol, required the understanding that you were a visitor in something far older than your civilization. The nemeton and the Druids together give us the most plausible context for Cernunnos worship. Not a distant god approached through priests in temples, but a presence encountered in the wild itself. A deity whose domain was literally all around his worshippers every time they entered the forest. This intimacy between deity and environment is one of the things that made Celtic religion so difficult for Rome to suppress. You can close a temple. You cannot close a forest. Central to understanding Cernunnos is the Celtic concept of the otherworld. Celtic cosmology, reconstructed from the fragments we have primarily from Irish and Welsh sources, did not divide reality into a simple binary of natural and supernatural. The world as experienced by human beings was not the only world. Existing alongside it in close and sometimes terrifyingly accessible proximity was a realm referred to by various names. In Irish sources, it becomes the Shia, the Turna en Og, the land of eternal youth. In Welsh material, it appears as Annwn. In Gaulish tradition, we have less precise terminology, but the concept appears consistent. The otherworld was not simply the realm of the dead, though the dead resided there. It was an entire parallel dimension of reality, accessible at certain times and certain places. It was described in Irish mythological texts as a place of extraordinary beauty, of feasting that never ends, of youth that never fades. But it was also a place of uncanny danger, of rules that did not operate as they did in the mortal realm. Time moved differently there. What seemed like a single night might be 100 years. The boundaries between the worlds were permeable at specific moments. The great festivals of the Celtic year were times of crossing. Samhain at the end of October, when the year died and was reborn, was particularly a time when the otherworld and the mortal world drew close. When the dead could walk among the living. When the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. The locations of crossing were liminal places. Caves whose dark passages led down into the earth. Islands surrounded by water. Certain hills and mounds associated with the entrances to the world below. And the forest. The deep forest, beyond the cleared fields and the settled paths, was a place where the boundary between worlds was uncertain, and Cernunnos inhabited that uncertain space. He was not simply the lord of forests in the sense of a nature spirit or an ecological deity, as modern paganism might conceive him. He was the guardian of the threshold between the human world and what lay beyond it. Between the world of daylight, settlement, agriculture, and civilization, and the world of the wild, the dark, the liminal, and the divine. This is why the stag appears so consistently in Celtic tradition as a creature that leads its pursuers across boundaries. The otherworldly stag in Celtic mythology is always a messenger from beyond, a creature that leads the hunter not to its death, but to somewhere else entirely. The hunter who follows the white stag or the golden stag in Celtic story does not end up with venison. He ends up somewhere he had not expected to be, in the presence of powers he had not expected to encounter. And Cernunnos, as the master of animals, as the Lord who sends the stag forth and calls it back, governed that threshold. He determined whether the hunter followed the stag home or followed it into the wild forever. This role as threshold guardian, as the deity of the liminal space between the human world and the other world, runs through everything we understand about him. He is the principle of wildness itself, the force that refuses to be fully domesticated, fully understood, fully contained within the categories that civilization imposes on experience. He is the part of the world that remains, despite everything, beyond human control. The ancient Celts held a cyclical view of existence that is difficult for the modern Western mind to fully inhabit. Death was not an ending, it was a transition. The soul moved through multiple forms and multiple lives. The other world was not a final destination, but a stage in an ongoing journey. The great cycle turned, and what entered the dark would eventually emerge again, transformed into the light. For Cernunnos, the association with death and regeneration is implicit in his symbolism from the very beginning. The cycle of the antlers, the serpent shedding its skin, the stag as both the creature that dies to sustain the living and the creature that embodies nobility and power. All of his symbols participate in the theme of transformation through apparent endings, but in some representations and in some aspects of his imagery, Cernunnos seems to take on a more specifically chthonic quality, more specifically associated with the realm of the dead and the earth below. The overflowing vessels associated with some Cernunnos images, bags or bowls of coins, or grain spilling their contents at his feet, have been interpreted in multiple ways. Some scholars see these as representing the god's role as distributor of material abundance. Others have argued that the coins specifically suggest something more complex. In the ancient world, coins were placed with the dead as payment for passage into the afterlife. A deity associated with bags of coins might speak to his authority, not just over material abundance in the world of the living, but over the resources that accompany the dead on their journey. The serpent connection deepens this. In virtually every ancient culture surrounding the Celtic world, the serpent was a chthonic creature. It moved between the surface and the earth below. It was associated with death and with what lay beneath. The ram-headed serpent coiling upward toward Cernunnos' hand might represent the power of the chthonic realm being channeled upward, the force of the world below being mediated through the god who stands at the boundary. Some scholars have proposed that Cernunnos was associated with the cycle of vegetation itself, not in the manner of a purely agricultural deity, but in the deeper sense. The descent of vitality into the earth in autumn, its return in spring, the death that is not an ending, but a turning. If this interpretation is correct, then Cernunnos was not merely the lord of living animals in the forest above ground. He was the lord of the entire cycle, above and below, living and dead, the forest and what fed it from beneath. This would make him a deity of truly comprehensive power, not confined to one aspect of existence, but presiding over the full arc of it, from the burst of new antler growth in spring to the shedding in autumn, from the abundance of the living forest to the dark earth that receives the dead and returns them transformed. It would also explain why his suppression by Christianity was so thorough and so specifically targeted, and why the figure used to replace him in the Christian imagination was so specifically constructed to embody everything the church needed people to fear. To understand what happened to Cernunnos, we must understand what happened to the Celts. The story of Celtic civilization's destruction is one of the most consequential cultural catastrophes in European history. It was not a single event, but a process spanning several centuries and several distinct causes. To see Cernunnos' disappearance clearly, we need to trace that destruction carefully. It began with Roman military expansion, starting in the 2nd century BCE and accelerating dramatically under Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul from 58 to 50 BCE. Rome systematically conquered the Celtic territories of continental Europe. Caesar's Gallic Wars resulted in deaths and enslavements of a scale that modern historians still debate. But that was, by any measure, catastrophic for the Gaulish population. Ancient sources give figures that, even heavily discounted, suggest millions of people killed or enslaved within a decade. Rome understood something that every successful empire understands. Military conquest is not enough. You can defeat an army in the field and still fail to conquer a people. As long as a conquered population maintains an alternative source of cultural authority, an alternative identity, an alternative explanation of who they are and what the world means, they will resist. They will rebel. They will wait for their moment. The Druids represented that alternative authority for the Celts. They were not simply priests who could be replaced by different priests. They were the living library of Celtic civilization. They held the mythology, the law, the history, the cosmology in their trained memories. While the Druids existed, Celtic identity had a backbone. Rome moved deliberately against them. Their sacred groves were cut down, not accidentally, in the course of military operations, but deliberately as acts of cultural erasure. The Romans understood that the groves were not merely religious sites. They were the physical homes of a tradition that, as long as it stood, would provide a focus for resistance. Under the Emperor Claudius, the practice of Druidism in the Roman Empire was made a capital offense. The historian Tacitus describes the Roman assault on the Druidic center on the island of Mona, modern Anglesey, off the coast of Wales, in 60 CE. The Roman soldiers advanced on the shore, where the Druids stood with arms raised to the sky, calling down curses on the invaders. Women moved between them in black robes with torches in their hands, like furies. The Roman troops, initially paralyzed by the spectacle, recovered their discipline and attacked. The grove was cut down. The altars were destroyed. Whatever practices had been conducted in those groves for centuries or millennia ended there on the shore of Anglesey. Roman cultural assimilation completed what military conquest began. The wealthy and ambitious among the conquered Gauls adopted Roman customs, Roman dress, Roman religion, Roman political identity. The provincial aristocracy became Roman provincials. They built Roman-style towns. They worshipped Roman gods, sometimes alongside Celtic deities in a syncretic fusion. The next generation was educated in Latin, thought in Latin, aspired to Roman careers. Within a few generations, Gaulish Celtic identity, for the upper classes at least, had largely dissolved into Roman provincial identity. Celtic languages survived longer in rural areas, among people who had less contact with Roman culture. But without the Druidic class to maintain and transmit the sacred tradition, Celtic religion in Gaul gradually eroded. The gods survived in local forms, sometimes merged with Roman equivalents in inscriptions that paired Celtic deity names with Roman ones. Cernunnos imagery continued to appear on objects into the Roman period, as the pillar of the boatman demonstrates. But what was known about him, the stories, the theology, the rituals, eroded with each generation that passed without formal transmission. In Ireland, which was never conquered by Rome, Celtic culture survived most fully. And it is from Ireland that we have the richest, if still fragmentary, record of pre-Christian Celtic mythology. The Irish mythological cycles, written down by Christian monks in the early medieval period, preserve material that stretches back to the pre-Christian era. Cernunnos does not appear by name in Irish literature, but scholars have identified figures in Irish mythology who share his characteristics so closely that they are almost certainly his Irish equivalents or cognates. The Dagda, the good god of Irish tradition, is one of the Tuatha De Danann, the divine race of pre-Christian Irish mythology. He is associated with abundance, with the fertile earth, with a magical cauldron that never empties, and a club that can kill or restore life. He is depicted as a powerful, somewhat wild figure associated with the primal forces of nature. He presides over harvest and death in the same gesture. Then there is the mysterious Dawn, Lord of the Dead in Irish tradition, who rules over a realm beneath the earth and the sea where the dead gather. His association with cattle and with the dark abundance that death feeds into the cycle of life echoes themes that appear in continental Cernunnos imagery and in the figure, sometimes called the Lord of Animals in Irish tales, the being whose permission must be sought before the hunt can succeed, who governs the movement of game through the forest and can grant or withhold the hunter's success. We hear the clearest echo of the Gaulish god. These connections suggest that the deity known from continental imagery as Cernunnos had cognates and equivalents in the Irish tradition, even though the specific name and some specific imagery were filtered differently through the Irish cultural lens. The principle was the same. The the Horned One, by whatever name, presided over the wild and its cycles. He was the authority you acknowledged when you entered the forest. And now we arrive at the most dramatic chapter in Cernunnos' history, the one that explains why his name was forgotten, why his image was buried beneath cathedrals, and why his shadow stretched across the next 1,000 years of European culture in a form so transformed as to be almost unrecognizable. Christianity arrived in Celtic Britain and Ireland in the early centuries of the Common Era. In Britain, it spread during the Roman period, and then accelerated after the Roman withdrawal in the 5th century. In Ireland, the traditional beginning of the formal mission is placed in the 5th century, though Christianity was present before the famous missionaries arrived. In both cases, conversion was a complex, multi-generational process that involved significant negotiation between the new faith and the existing religious culture. The Christian missionaries were not naive about what they were displacing. They understood that the old gods had real power in the minds and hearts of the people they were converting. They could not simply announce that the gods were fictional. People had experienced things in relation to these deities. They had received what they understood as answers to prayers. The gods were real to them in the most immediate experiential sense. Christian strategy for dealing with this was twofold. First, accommodation, where local sacred sites, festivals, or practices could be reframed in Christian terms. They were incorporated rather than destroyed. Sacred wells became dedicated to saints. Seasonal festivals were given Christian names while retaining their old timing and some of their old character. Local deities were demoted to saints, their stories retold with Christian moral conclusions. The enormous goddess became a holy abbess. The divine smith became the patron of metalworkers. Second, and more important for Cernunnos, demonization. Those aspects of the old religion that could not be comfortably accommodated were reframed not as false or misguided, but as actively diabolic. The old gods were not mere superstitions. They were demons. They were the devil's servants, drawing the unwary away from God and into spiritual destruction. To honor them was not innocent error. It was an invitation to damnation. Cernunnos was particularly vulnerable to this second strategy. Consider what he looked like from a Christian perspective. He was a male deity with antlers or horns on his head. He was associated with wild, dark, untamed places beyond the boundaries of civilization and law. He was connected to the serpent, the creature most thoroughly condemned in all of Christian tradition as the embodiment of diabolical temptation, the form the enemy had taken in the garden. He governed forces that were explicitly outside human social and moral order. He was connected to death and to the realm of the dead. He was, in his deepest nature, a power that operated entirely outside the sanctions of civilized religion, that answered to no higher authority, that could not be subordinated to any cosmic moral hierarchy. He might have been designed as a template for the Christian devil, and that, in essence, is what happened to him. The specific visual form of the devil, as he developed in medieval Christian iconography, is not derived from biblical sources alone. The biblical Satan is primarily a legal figure, an adversary in a cosmic courtroom, an accuser. The horned, cloven-hoofed, animal-legged creature of medieval nightmare is drawn from the old gods of the people the church was converting. Pan, the Greek god of the wild with his goat legs and horns, contributed significantly to the emerging image, but the Celtic territories where Cernunnos was most deeply worshipped contributed something specific and powerful. The horns, the wildness, the presiding over animals and the dark, the connection to death, the ancient pre-civilizational authority. Ecclesiastical texts from the early medieval period in Britain and Ireland record the church's ongoing struggle against residual practices associated with the old gods. Penitential texts, the church's instruction manuals for priests hearing confession, specify penances for specific prohibited behaviors. Among the behaviors that appear repeatedly in these early medieval documents, men who dress as stags at the new year, men who make offerings in the forest, men who seek the old powers at the ancient seasonal festivals. The stag dressing specifically is remarkable. It appears in condemnations from multiple regions and multiple centuries of the early medieval period. Men who wore stag masks or stag costumes at the winter threshold festivals, the Old Samhain, the Old Kalends of January, were to be penanced. They were doing something the church considered not merely foolish, but genuinely diabolical. The persistence of this practice, documented in condemnation after condemnation across centuries, tells us something crucial. Despite the official conversion of the Celtic peoples, despite the loss of the Druidic class, despite generations of Christian teaching, something persisted. In the folk memory of communities across the old Celtic world, the association between the liminal times of year, the stag, and a presiding power of the wild remained. Not as theology, not with conscious understanding of what was being remembered, but as felt necessity, as ritual that continued because it felt true and necessary, even when the framework explaining it had been lost. The church's response to this persistence was the gradual, systematic construction of an alternative narrative. The horned figure was not a god. It was the enemy. To seek it was to seek damnation. By the high medieval period, the figure of the devil as depicted in church art, in theological treatises, and eventually in the witch trial confessions that would destroy tens of thousands of lives, bore a striking and unmistakable resemblance to the ancient god of the forest. Horns where antlers had been, cloven hooves where the seated stillness had been, presiding over darkness and death, not as the natural authority of the cycle, but as the ruler of hell. His very antiquity reframed as evidence of his true diabolical nature. He was old because he was fallen. He had been deceiving humanity since the beginning. Cernunnos had been inverted. His antlers became the devil's horns. His mastery over wild animals became the diabolic command of demons. His connection to the chthonic realm became the rulership of hell. His threshold guarding role became the gateway to damnation, and the name Cernunnos, never widely recorded in writing in any case, was simply lost. But here is what the Church could not fully achieve. It could rename Cernunnos. It could invert his image. It could make the mention of his true nature dangerous, and the performance of his rites an act of spiritual self-destruction. It could transform his image into the devil. It could make those who remembered the old ways vulnerable to accusation, prosecution, and execution. It could not make him stop being real to the people who lived at the edge of the forest. Across medieval Europe, from the British Isles through France, the Germanic territories, into Scandinavia, there is a persistent tradition of what is variously called the Wild Hunt, the Furious Host, the Raging Army, or dozens of other local names. The tradition appears in different forms, wearing different regional costumes, carrying different leaders depending on the local mythology. But its core is consistent enough that it clearly represents a single underlying idea. On certain nights, particularly the nights associated with the old seasonal transitions, a host sweeps across the sky and the earth. The host is led by a powerful figure, often male, sometimes described as a king or lord, sometimes explicitly identified as the devil. The riders are accompanied by hounds whose baying fills the night sky. To witness the hunt uninvited is dangerous. To be caught in its path may be fatal. To hear it pass is an omen that demands response. The leader of the hunt changes with the local tradition. In Norse-influenced areas, it is Odin who leads the host. In some German traditions, it is a female figure, Holda or Perchta, who leads. In various British traditions, the figure is Herne the Hunter. Herne the Hunter is perhaps the most direct surviving echo of Cernunnos in English folklore. He is a spectral huntsman, antlered, surrounded by spectral hounds, associated with death and omen and the wild night. He haunts Windsor Forest. Shakespeare knew the tradition and placed a reference to Herne in The Merry Wives of Windsor. Herne's name, almost certainly derived from the same root as Cernunnos, represents a survival of the god in folk memory, transformed and diminished, but still recognizable if you know what you are looking for. The Wild Hunt, more broadly, represents the persistence of the principle that Cernunnos embodied. The idea that the wild has its own lord, that the night has its own authority, that the forces beyond the firelight are organized around a governing power that operates outside human moral and social categories. A power that existed before the categories were invented and will exist after they are forgotten. Christianity could make that Lord into the devil. It could not make the belief in his existence go away, because the belief was not primarily a theological claim. It was an observation. The wild is real. The night is real. The forces beyond the edge of the village do not operate according to the moral codes of the village. whatever governs them is something other than what governs the human world. The witch trial confessions of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries provide the most disturbing evidence for this persistence. These confessions, extracted under torture from people who were almost certainly not practicing any coherent religious tradition, do reveal something of the folk religious imagination of early modern Europeans, and what they reveal is a persistent association between a figure, sometimes called the devil, and characteristics that correspond far more closely to Cernunnos than to the biblical Satan, the figure who appears in witch trial confessions, presides over gatherings in wild places, in forests, at crossroads, at the boundaries of settlements. He appears at liminal times, the old seasonal festivals that the Church had never fully Christianized. He is associated with animals, sometimes appearing in animal form himself. He governs the powers of nature. He offers knowledge, power, and the ability to move between worlds, whatever these confessions actually represent, whether genuine folk practice, fantasy induced by torture, or some distorted survival of pre-Christian ritual. They preserve a shape that is recognizable. The Lord of the Wild Night, the one met at the forest's edge at the dark of the year, the one who distributes power to those who acknowledge him and seek his gifts. Cernunnos, wearing a new and terrible name, but still essentially himself. In 1899, the author Kenneth Grahame published a chapter that would eventually form part of The Wind in the Willows. The chapter was called The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Two small animals travel on the river at night in search of a lost otter cub. They are drawn by music, by a piping that fills them with simultaneous awe and a longing they cannot name. As dawn breaks, they find the cub sleeping peacefully at the feet of a vast, antlered figure who sits on an island in the river, surrounded by animals who have gathered in the night. The figure is described with absolute reverence and absolute terror, something so far beyond ordinary experience that the animals can barely hold its image in their minds. And then it is gone, and the grief of its absence is almost unbearable. And then they forget. They are allowed to forget, as if the encounter were too much for mortal minds to carry fully. Grahame's episode, written without any scholarly apparatus or explicit mythological reference, intuited something very close to the ancient experience of Cernunnos. The figure on the island, in the liminal space between water and land, at the liminal time between night and day, attended by the animals, beyond human categories of good and evil, encountered with a mixture of devotion and absolute fear that cannot be fully retained by the human mind. This is, structurally and emotionally, very close to what the ancient sources of adjacent traditions describe when they speak of encountering the powers of the wild. The 19th and early 20th centuries more broadly saw a revival of interest in pre-Christian European religion. Romanticism had primed the European imagination to value the primitive, the sublime, the ancient. The emerging academic disciplines of comparative mythology, folklore studies, and archaeology were producing new knowledge about the pre-Christian world, and a growing dissatisfaction with institutional Christianity among educated Europeans created space for alternative spiritual orientations. Gerald Gardner, claiming in the 1940s and 1950s to be reviving an ancient witch cult, drew heavily on this heritage. Whatever the actual historical roots of Wicca, Gardner's synthesis placed a god-goddess pairing at the center of its theology. And the god was, unmistakably, modeled on Cernunnos, the Wiccan horned god, lord of the wild, of the hunt, of death and rebirth. Identified with the cycle of the seasons is Cernunnos wearing the clothing of a 20th century spiritual movement. Through Wicca and the broader neo-pagan movement, Cernunnos has returned to active worship for the first time since the conversion of the Celtic peoples. He is honored by hundreds of thousands of people across the English-speaking world and beyond. Books are written about him. Altars are dedicated to him. Rituals are performed at the old seasonal turning points that he governed in ancient times. But honesty requires acknowledging that the modern Cernunnos is not identical to the ancient one. The ancient Cernunnos was not a comfortable deity. He was the lord of the hunt, which means he was the lord of death. He governed the forces that threatened human life as well as those that sustained it. His power was not benevolent in any simple sense. He distributed abundance, yes, but he also withheld it. He sent the deer to the hunter's arrow or sent them away. He was the authority over the predator as well as the prey. The modern neo-pagan Cernunnos has in many traditions been softened into a figure of ecological concern and masculine, nurturing energy, a kind of divine forest father, protective and accessible, a counterpart to the triple goddess's more prominent role. This interpretation has genuine roots in some aspects of the ancient imagery. The seated figure surrounded by animals does project a quality of calm authority. There is something in the iconography that is not threatening in the way that a war god's image would be threatening, but it omits the other face, the face that the church correctly identified as dangerous and therefore systematically transformed into the image of the enemy, the face of the lord of predation, of the wild that does not care about human welfare because it operates on a scale and by a logic in which human welfare is not the primary variable, of the power that is entirely outside human moral categories, not because it is evil, but because it is old, older than morality, older than the categories. Other modern practitioners, working in traditions that call themselves traditional witchcraft or reconstructionist paganism, maintain both faces deliberately. For these practitioners, Cernunnos is honored not because he is safe, but because he is not. Because approaching a power that is genuinely wild, genuinely connected to death as well as life, genuinely outside human control, is a spiritually transformative act in a way that approaching a comfortable and manageable deity is not. They argue that a Cernunnos made entirely benevolent and accessible has been domesticated. And a domesticated wild god is a contradiction in terms. The symbols associated with Cernunnos, taken seriously as a coherent system rather than as decorative motifs, encode a theology of the natural world that is worth examining in full. The antlers encode the cycle of death and regeneration already discussed, but they also encode time. The stag's antlers track the seasons. Their growth and shedding is a biological calendar. Cernunnos, wearing permanent antlers, is wearing the cycle itself on his head. He is not subject to time in the way that creatures who are born and die are subject to it. He embodies the pattern that time enacts. The serpent encodes the chthonic, the earth power, the connection between the surface world and what lies beneath. But the serpent also encodes transformation. It is the creature that sheds its entire skin and emerges renewed. This is not death and rebirth in the dramatic sense that the stag's antlers suggest. It is something subtler, the continuous shedding of the old form to reveal the new one that was growing beneath it all along. Cernunnos associated with the serpent is Cernunnos as the principle of ongoing transformation rather than dramatic cyclical rebirth. The torque, as discussed, encodes relationship, the obligation between the Lord and those who acknowledge him, the covenant between the hunter and the hunted, between the human community and the wild that sustains it. This covenant is not sentimental. It does not promise that the forest will always provide, that the hunt will always succeed, that the community will always be safe. It promises only that if the relationship is conducted correctly, with proper acknowledgement and proper restraint, the cycle will continue. The abundance will flow. Not because the Lord of the wild is kind, but because that is the nature of the cycle when it is not disrupted. The cross-legged posture encodes stillness at the center of motion. The world turns around the one who does not turn. The seasons change around the one who does not change. The animals come and go around the one who remains. This stillness is not passivity. It is the stillness of the axis, of the thing that everything else orbits. To achieve even a moment of that kind of stillness, that rooted presence at the center of the wild's turning, may be the closest a human being can come to the experience of Cernunnos. The forest itself, the nemeton, the sacred grove, encodes the threshold. It is the place where the human world ends and something else begins, where the ordered, plowed, named, claimed human world gives way to the older order of the wild, where the rules change and the authorities change, where what governs is not human law or human morality, but the older law of the cycle, of predation and survival and death and return. All of these symbols together constitute not just a religious system, but an ecological theology, a systematic understanding of the natural world as sacred, governed by authorities that must be acknowledged and respected, organized around principles that operate independently of human will or human convenience. The Celts who worshipped Cernunnos were not naive or ignorant about nature. They understood it intimately, in the practical sense of people whose lives depended on that understanding. They knew which plants were poisonous and which were healing. They knew the habits of the animals they hunted. They knew the patterns of weather and season that governed their survival. But they also understood something that our culture has largely lost. That understanding the mechanisms of the natural world does not give you authority over it. That the cycle operates whether or not you acknowledge it. That the wild has its own order that predates and will outlast the human order. And that your survival as an individual and as a community depends not just on understanding the mechanisms, but on maintaining the correct relationship with the powers that govern them. Cernunnos was the embodiment of that relationship. To honor him was to honor the wild itself, to acknowledge the forest's authority, to enter it as a guest rather than an owner, to take what was needed and acknowledge what was given. This is, stripped of its mythological language, a sophisticated ecological ethic, one that arose not from abstract philosophy, but from generations of intimate relationship with the living world. We live in a moment when that ethic is urgently relevant, not because we should return to pre-modern subsistence hunting, but because the fundamental orientation it encodes, the recognition that the natural world has its own authority that operates independently of human convenience, that the cycle will continue whether or not we choose to participate in it correctly, that the wild is not a resource but a presence, is something our current civilization has systematically dismantled and desperately needs to recover. Cernunnos cannot give us that recovery. He is a figure from a specific cultural tradition that is largely gone. But the principle he embodies, the acknowledgement that the wild has its Lord, and that Lord is not us, is older than any specific culture. It is as old as the sorcerer of Twafriers, staring down from the cave wall at the animals gathered below him. 15,000 years ago, we have traveled a long road, from the cave walls of the Paleolithic to the peat bogs of Denmark, from the sacred groves of Gaul to the penitentials of early Christian Britain, from the wild hunt of medieval folklore to the altars of modern paganism. We have seen Cernunnos in all his aspects, lord of animals and of the hunt, guardian of the threshold between the human world and the wild, holder of the cycle of death and regeneration, distributor of abundance and its withholder, deity of the liminal times and liminal spaces, the still center around which the wild world turns. We have watched him be suppressed, inverted, turned inside out, buried literally beneath the foundations of cathedrals, transformed into the image of the thing most feared by the civilization that replaced his. And we have watched him persist, in folk custom, in fairy tale, in the stag dressing of peasants who no longer remembered why they did it, but felt that they must, in the wild hunt that swept across the medieval imagination, in the antlered figure that keeps appearing at the edge of things when the light fades, in the instinctive human sense that the forest has a lord, and that lord is not human. The dark history of Cernunnos is not a story of corruption or of degeneration from some original purity. It is a story of silencing, a deliberate and largely successful attempt to cut humanity's awareness of a certain kind of sacred power off at its root. But you cannot fully silence something that corresponds to a real aspect of existence. The wild is real. The cycle of death and regeneration is real. The threshold between the human world and what lies beyond it is real. And the principle of the master of animals, the power that sits at the center of the wild's turning and governs the relationship between humanity and the living world around it, that is real in the sense that the truth it encodes cannot be eliminated by deciding it does not exist. The forest continues to exist beyond the edge of your city. The stag still runs in whatever wilderness remains. The cycle still turns. Things die and are transformed and return in new form. The serpents still move through the earth. The great animals of the wild still live their lives according to a logic that has nothing to do with human priorities. And at the threshold between the human world and the wild, at the edge of every forest, at every crossroads between the ordered and the untamed, Cernunnos sits, antlered against the sky. Animals gathered around him, perfectly still, watching with eyes that have watched since before there were words for what watching means. He is not waiting for you to recognize him. He does not need your recognition to be what he is. He was here before your civilization arrived. He will be here after it is gone. But if you stand at the edge of the trees on a dark night, at Samhain, or at the winter solstice, or at any of the old turning points of the year, if you feel that particular quality of stillness that falls when the human world recedes and something older takes its place, if you hear in the distance the sound of hounds that may not be dogs at all, if you sense at the back of your skull the weight of something enormous and ancient turning its attention briefly in your direction, then perhaps you are standing, as our ancestors stood for thousands of years, at the edge of his domain. And perhaps you understand, without needing to be told, why they left offerings at the tree line, why they spoke certain names with their eyes lowered, why they went into the forest with gratitude and came out with gratitude if they came out at all. Because the wild does not belong to us. We belong to it. The antlers rise against the darkening sky. The wolf is still. The serpent coils in his hand. The torque gleams in the last of the light. Cernunnos watches, as he has always watched, as he will always watch, from the threshold between the world you know and the world that was here first, holding his gifts and his terror with equal stillness, the eternal Lord of the wild, and the wildness in you knows his name. We returned to the Gundestrup Cauldron several times in this account, and we should pause to give it the full attention it deserves, because it is one of the most complex and revelatory religious objects to survive from the ancient world. And its Cernunnos panel is only one piece of a larger puzzle. The cauldron itself is remarkable as an object. It is made of gilded silver, not a material used lightly in any ancient culture. Its size, nearly 2 feet across, makes it impractical as a functional vessel. It is clearly a ritual object of the highest importance, and yet it was found dismantled in a Danish peat bog, its panels separated and stacked, apparently deliberately decommissioned and deposited. Why would a cult object of such obvious importance and expense be taken apart and buried in a bog? The deposition of valuable objects in bogs, rivers, and lakes was a widespread practice in Celtic and Germanic Europe. The archaeological record is full of swords, torques, cauldrons, and other objects of obvious value that were deliberately destroyed or deposited in water. This was not disposal of unwanted goods. It was sacrifice, the giving of something precious to the powers associated with water and the earth below. The Gundestrup Cauldron being deposited in a bog was its final ritual act. It was given to the powers it had served, perhaps at the end of a period of use, perhaps when the tradition it served was threatened, perhaps at a moment of crisis when the community that owned it made a final offering before dispersal or defeat. This context of ritual sacrifice deepens everything the cauldron depicts. Its panels are not decorative art. They are theological statements made by people who took these statements seriously enough to create an object of extraordinary expense and craftsmanship to hold them. The outer panels of the cauldron show large individual deity figures, most unidentified with certainty, but each clearly of divine status. One holds a wheel associated with solar deity figures. One appears female and is shown grasping a figure to her right and grasping a dog or wolf by the hind leg. The specific identities remain debated, but the overall impression is of a gathering of major powers. The inner panels show what appear to be ritual scenes. A column of foot soldiers marching toward a large figure who appears to be plunging a human or deity figure into a large vessel, possibly a cauldron of rebirth. Another panel shows a procession of cavalry. Another shows a deity figure flanked by animals in what may be a mythological scene. A bull sacrifice is depicted on another panel, and then the Cernunnos panel. Its position on an inner panel, facing inward, suggests that it was meant to be seen from inside the cauldron, or that it represents an interior truth rather than an exterior display. The god as the interior principle, the center around which the other imagery organizes. His cross-legged posture on this panel is particularly deliberate. The figure is fully composed, fully still, fully present. Around him, chaos swirls. Animals move in every direction. The space is full of life and energy, and at the center of all of it, completely unaffected, sits the horned lord. This compositional choice is itself a theological statement. The wild is not chaos. It has a center. It has an organizing principle. The apparent chaos of animal life, of the hunt, of predation and survival, is held together by something that does not participate in the chaos, but presides over it. Cernunnos is that organizing principle, present in the wild without being subject to it. The stag that stands at his right on this panel is depicted at virtually the same scale as Cernunnos himself. This is unusual in ancient art, where relative scale typically indicates relative importance or power. But here, the stag and the god are nearly equal in visual weight. This suggests not that the stag is a god, but that the god and the stag share a quality. That Cernunnos is, in some sense, the principle that the stag embodies most fully, that where the stag is the most perfect expression of the wild in the animal world. Cernunnos is the wild itself expressed as divine authority. The ram-headed serpent ascending toward Cernunnos' left hand on this panel is one of the most debated elements in all of Celtic iconography. No such creature exists in nature. It appears in several other Celtic contexts, always associated with divine figures, always suggesting something about the relationship between the earth below and the world above. The ascending motion of the serpent in this panel, moving from the earth level toward the divine figure's hand, may represent the chthonic power being received and channeled by the god. He takes what rises from the deep earth and distributes it. He is the intermediary between the powers below and the world of the living above. The torque he holds in his right hand, extended outward toward the viewer or toward the stag, is the promise of that distribution. The abundance of the wild offered to those who acknowledge the one who governs it. To understand how Cernunnos was worshipped, we must understand how the Celts experienced time. Because the worship of Cernunnos was not constant and undifferentiated. Like all deities in all ancient traditions, he was particularly present at particular moments. The Celtic year was organized around 4 major festivals, astronomical and agricultural markers that divided the year into its great seasonal movements. These festivals were Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad. Each marked a transition, and Cernunnos, as the lord of transitions, would have been particularly present at each of them, though not equally. Samhain, falling at the end of October and the beginning of November, was the most powerful of the 4. It marked the death of the year and the beginning of the dark half. The herds were assessed. The animals that could not be fed through winter were slaughtered. The meat was preserved. The land withdrew into itself. The boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead grew thin to the point of translucency. This was when the dead walked, when the other world pressed closest against the mortal world, when the rules that normally separated the two relaxed their grip. For a deity associated with death and regeneration, with the cycle of the wild, with the threshold between the human world and what lay beyond it, Samhain was the preeminent festival. This was his season in its most concentrated form. darkest part of the year, when the forest was bare, when the animals moved to their winter ranges, when the hunt was at its most desperate and most sacred, when the very texture of reality shifted at the forest's edge, the offerings left at liminal places during Samhain, at crossroads, at cave mouths, at forest edges, the fires lit on hilltops, the careful acknowledgement of the powers that governed the dark half of the year. All of this would have been directed in part toward the Lord of the Wild, who presided over the darkness and what moved through it. Beltane, the great spring festival at the beginning of May, was the opposite pole, the beginning of the light half of the year. The cattle driven between fires to purify them before the summer grazing, the land awakening, the wild resurgent, the great stag in his new antlers, the serpents emerging from the earth, the forest filling again with life. This was the other face of Cernunnos' power, not the Lord of the dark and the dead, but the Lord of the bursting, fecund, almost overwhelming vitality of the living wild in full summer. The same deity, but presenting his other aspect. The spring face rather than the autumn face. The returning antlers rather than the shed ones. Understanding that Cernunnos governed both poles, both the death and the return, both the dark and the reborn light, is essential to understanding him as more than a nature deity in a simple sense. He did not merely govern the pleasant parts of the natural world. He governed the whole cycle, the parts that sustained human life and the parts that threatened it, the abundance and the scarcity, the prey and the predator. This comprehensive authority over the full cycle, rather than just one pleasant aspect of it, is what distinguished the most powerful Celtic deities. They were not specialized gods of specific happy things. They were governing principles of entire domains, which meant they governed those domains in all their aspects. Before the Celts, before the Bronze Age cultures from which Celtic civilization emerged, there were the Proto-Indo-Europeans, a people or group of peoples who lived in the steppes north of the Black Sea somewhere around 4000 to 3000 BCE, whose language eventually became the ancestor of Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Persian, Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, and dozens of other language families. When linguists reconstructed the Proto-Indo-European language from the systematic comparison of its descendants, they also began to reconstruct elements of Proto-Indo-European mythology and religion. The results are fascinating and relevant to Cernunnos. Specifically, the Proto-Indo-Europeans appear to have had a lord of animals in their religious system, a figure who presided over the wild and governed the relationship between human communities and the animal world. This figure appears in different forms across the Indo-European daughter traditions. In Vedic and later Hindu tradition, this figure becomes Pashupati, Lord of Animals, one of the oldest epithets of the deity, who later develops into Shiva. The seal images from the Indus Valley civilization, predating the Vedic texts by 1,000 years or more, show a figure seated cross-legged and surrounded by animals, sometimes with what appear to be horns or a horned headdress. The resemblance to Cernunnos is close enough that scholars have debated seriously whether there is a connection going back to the Proto-Indo-European period. Shiva himself, in his aspect as Pashupatinath, and in his role as Nataraja, the lord of the cosmic dance, shares deep structural similarities with Cernunnos. Both are deities of the threshold and the liminal. Both govern creation and destruction simultaneously. Both are associated with the wild, untamed forces that civilized religion tends to find uncomfortable. Both are worshipped in forest and cremation ground, as well as temple. Both are, in their deepest nature, principles of transformation rather than of stable governance. The parallel is not coincidental and is not merely superficial. It points to an ancient common inheritance, a shared understanding from before the splitting of the Indo-European languages, of a cosmic principle that governs the wild and the cycle of death and regeneration. This connection situates Cernunnos not just within Celtic religion, but within the deep structure of Western and South Asian religious thought. He is not an anomaly or a curiosity. He is one of the oldest ideas that the ancestors of half the world's population carried with them when they dispersed from the Eurasian steppe 5,000 years ago. In the Germanic tradition, Odin shares certain characteristics with Cernunnos, though the overlap is partial and the two figures are distinct. Odin as the leader of the wild hunt, as a figure who moves between worlds, who governs the dead and can summon them, who possesses knowledge that ordinary deities do not have access to, echoes the chthonic, threshold-crossing aspects of Cernunnos. The fact that Odin took the leadership of the hunt in the Norse-influenced areas where that tradition persisted suggests a cultural negotiation. The most powerful local divine authority assuming the role that had previously belonged to the Celtic god in regions where Celtic and Germanic cultures overlapped. The Roman god Silvanus, deity of forests and of the land beyond the fields, shares Cernunnos' wild domain, if not his specific iconography. Mars in his agricultural and protective aspects rather than purely military ones. The Mars who protects the boundaries of the field and the community from what lies beyond, also echoes Cernunnos' threshold role. The Romans, encountering the Celtic deity when they moved into Gaulish territory, sometimes merged him with Silvanus or with Mercury. The latter perhaps because of Mercury's own role as a guide between worlds. None of these parallels diminish Cernunnos by reducing him to a local variant of something universal. Rather, they reveal the depth of the human insight that he embodies. The recognition that the wild has its lord is not a Celtic invention. It is a human truth. The Celts gave it one specific and extraordinary form. Other cultures gave it other forms, but all of them were pointing at the same thing: concrete archaeological evidence for specific practices of Cernunnos worship is limited, but not entirely absent. We have the objects themselves, the figurines, the carved reliefs, the coins and vessels bearing his image. These tell us that he was considered important enough to be depicted in expensive materials across a wide range of social contexts, from the high-status luxury of the Gundestrup Cauldron to the more modest scale of votive figurines that may have been offerings at shrines. We have the Pillar of the Boatman from Paris, erected by a guild of merchants. This is significant. It tells us that Cernunnos' worship was not confined to rural hunters or to specialized Druidic practitioners. The Boatmen of Paris, a prosperous and commercially engaged group, included him alongside Roman deities in a monument erected in the most public context available. A civic pillar in the capital of a Roman province. His worship, even in the Roman period, even in an urban context, was considered appropriate and important enough for public display. We have a small but telling body of evidence for votive deposits at liminal locations. Objects found at the entrances to caves, at forest edge locations, in bogs, and at river crossings that include antlered figures or objects associated with Cernunnos imagery. The pattern of deposition mirrors what we know about Celtic votive practice more broadly. The valuable object given to the power of the liminal place, the acknowledgement made at the threshold. We have the evidence from classical sources of sacred groves in Celtic territories. While these sources do not name Cernunnos specifically as the deity of any particular grove, the characteristics they describe, the wild location, the animal associations, the darkness and isolation, align with what we would expect of places sacred to the Lord of the Wild. And we have the archaeological evidence for stag cult practices across the Celtic world. Antlers incorporated into ritual deposits. Stag skulls placed at the entrances to enclosures. Stag bones in contexts that suggest ritual significance rather than ordinary food consumption. These practices, while not directly tied to Cernunnos by inscription, form part of the cultic landscape within which his worship was conducted. The cumulative picture is of a deity worshipped across a wide social range and a wide geographic range, whose worship was conducted particularly in wild and liminal locations, whose sacred season was the dark half of the year, and whose ritual objects and animals were associated with the themes of wildness, the cycle of life and death, and the threshold between the human world and what lay beyond it. It is not the detailed picture we might wish for. The absence of the Druidic written tradition makes it impossible to know what the Celts themselves said and thought and felt about Cernunnos in the full depth of their theology. But the picture that does emerge is coherent, consistent, and in its way complete enough to understand the essential principle. He was not a minor deity. He was not a specialized god of a single function. He was one of the organizing principles of the Celtic religious universe, governing the wild half of the world and its relationship with the human half. presiding over the great cycle of life and death that sustained and threatened human existence in equal measure. His near disappearance from the historical record is one of the great losses in the history of Western religion. His survival in underground form for over 1,000 years, emerging in folk practice and wild hunt tradition and stag masquerade, and eventually in modern revival, is one of the most remarkable stories of religious persistence we have. If Cernunnos means anything to the modern world, it is not primarily as an object of worship, though that has its own value for those called to it. It is as a principle, the principle that the wild has its own authority, that the natural world is not a backdrop to human activity, but the ground of it, the matrix in which human existence is embedded, and on which it depends. That the cycle of death and regeneration is not a problem to be solved, but the fundamental structure of existence itself. Our civilization has been, for 300 years, conducting an experiment in what happens when you systematically attempt to detach human existence from that principle. When you treat the wild not as a sacred domain with its own lord, but as a resource to be extracted. When you replace the acknowledgement of the cycle with the fantasy of indefinite growth. When you bury the old understanding under cathedrals and then under shopping centers and parking lots, the results of that experiment are becoming apparent. The forests are declining. The great animals are disappearing. The cycles that sustain the living world are being disrupted at rates that have no precedent in the period of human civilization. The wild is retreating, and as it retreats, the consequences for everything that depends on it, which is everything, are mounting. This is not a sermon. It is an observation about what the principle of Cernunnos encodes in its most fundamental form. The acknowledgement that you are a guest in the wild's domain, not its owner. That the torque is offered to you, not given permanently. That the abundance flows when the relationship is maintained correctly and dries up when it is not. The ancient Celts were not perfect ecologists. No human community has ever been, but they maintained, through the figure of Cernunnos and through the religious culture of which he was a part, an orientation toward the natural world that recognized its authority. That built into the structure of the year, into the practice of the hunt, into the passage between the fields and the forest, an acknowledgement that the wild was not yours to command. We lost that orientation. We buried it deliberately under centuries of theology that reframed the wild as fallen, as diabolical, as the domain of the enemy. The consequences are not supernatural. They are ecological, and the god sitting at the forest's edge, antlered still, attended by the animals that remain, watching with those ancient eyes as the world we have made works through the consequences of our choices, does not judge us by human standards. He simply watches as the cycle turns, as it has always turned. At the beginning of this account, we said that Cernunnos' story has three faces. Like the god himself, in some of his triple representations. Let us return to that structure now, not to summarize what we have covered, but to see it whole. The first face is the face of origins. It is the oldest face, looking back into the Paleolithic, into the cave where the sorcerer watches from the wall. This face tells us that the principle Cernunnos embodies is not a cultural invention. It is a recognition. The recognition that the wild has its governing power, that the animals have their lord, that the boundary between the human world and the natural world requires acknowledgement and negotiation. This is a truth that arises wherever human beings live in genuine proximity to the wild, and it has been arising independently in multiple cultures for as long as humanity has existed. Cernunnos is the Celtic form of that universal recognition, but the recognition itself is older than any culture. The second face is the face of transformation, and it is the darkest face. This is the face that watched the Druids die, that watched the groves burn, that watched its own image turned inside out and pressed into the service of the enemy it had never been. This face contains the most unsettling truth about religious history, that a civilization can successfully bury a principle, can invert its meaning so thoroughly that the very image of the god becomes the image of the devil. The church did not merely suppress Cernunnos. It performed a theological judo, using the power of his ancient authority to give its devil weight and terror. The devil is frightening partly because the devil was built from the raw material of a god who had been terrifying and magnificent for 3,000 years before Christianity existed. Knowing this does not make the devil less real as a theological concept for those who hold it, but it situates him historically, and it raises questions about what other inversions our cultural inheritance has performed on older truths. The third face is the face of endurance. It is perhaps the most surprising face, and in some ways the most moving. That a god forgotten by name for 1,000 years, suppressed by the most powerful institution in Western history, his very image transformed into an emblem of evil, should survive in folk practice and wild hunt tradition and stag masquerade, and eventually in conscious revival by hundreds of thousands of people in the 21st century. This is extraordinary. It tells us something about the persistence of certain kinds of truth, about the way that what is genuinely old and genuinely connected to something real in human experience cannot be fully killed, even by the most determined and comprehensive suppression. It changes form. It goes underground. It survives in fragments and shadows and half-remembered customs. But it does not end, because the forest does not end. The stag still runs. The serpent still moves through the earth. The cycle still turns. And at the threshold between the world we have made and the world that was here before us, the horned lord still sits, antlered against a darkening sky, perfectly still, watching with eyes older than memory, holding his gifts and his terror with equal and absolute calm. He has been waiting a long time for us to look up from our cities and remember him. He is patient. He has always been patient. That is the nature of something that does not age. That is the nature of the wild. After everything we have covered, after the cave paintings, and the cauldron, and the burning groves, and the witch trials, and the wild hunt, and the modern revival, we are left with a question that cannot be answered, but must be asked. Is Cernunnos real? The question has more than one meaning, and the different meanings deserve different responses. As a historical figure, as a deity actively worshipped by specific human communities over a specific period of time, yes, absolutely. There is no doubt that the people of the ancient Celtic world worshipped a deity corresponding to the antlered figure we have been discussing. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous on this point. Real people in real historical time made offerings to him, carved his image, carried his symbols, sought his favor for the hunt and the harvest and the transition through the dark half of the year. As a psychological or archetypal reality, yes, in the sense that the principle he embodies corresponds to something genuine in the structure of the natural world and in human experience of that world. The wild does have its own order that operates outside human control. The cycle of death and regeneration is real and is the foundation of all living things. The threshold between the human world and what lies beyond it is a real boundary that requires acknowledgement. Cernunnos, as the symbol of these truths, points at something that is as real as any truth that myth can point at, as a supernatural being with independent existence, a divine person who can hear prayers and respond to offerings, who presides over the forest in some metaphysical sense that goes beyond metaphor. That is the question that depends on what you already believe about the nature of the divine, and it is not a question that scholarship can answer. The ancient Celts believed it. Many modern practitioners believe it. Materialists will say no. This is one of the oldest arguments in human history and is unlikely to be settled here. But there is a fourth sense in which Cernunnos is real, and it is perhaps the most immediately relevant. He is real as a mirror. The image we hold of the wild and its governing principle reflects something about the relationship between our civilization and the natural world. When we look at the seated figure on the Gundestrup Cauldron, when we consider what it meant for the Celts to acknowledge the authority of the Lord of the forest, when we trace the suppression of that acknowledgement through centuries of theology and cultural erasure, we are looking at the history of how Western civilization came to relate to the natural world the way it does. The God who was inverted into the devil carried with him, in that transformation, the understanding that the wild had its own authority. By making that authority diabolical, by declaring that the powers beyond the edge of the village were the powers of the enemy, the Church did not merely suppress a pagan deity. It dismantled a way of relating to the natural world. It replaced acknowledgement with domination. It replaced the understanding that you were a guest in the forest with the theological mandate that the earth was given to humanity to use. Cernunnos is real as the record of what was lost in that transformation, as the image of an orientation toward the natural world that Western civilization abandoned deliberately, and whose abandonment we are living with the consequences of today. Whether or not you leave offerings at the tree line, whether or not you invoke his name at Samhain, whether or not you hold any theology at all, you are living in the world that was made when the horned Lord was buried. You are experiencing the consequences of the principle he embodied being declared diabolical and driven underground for 1,000 years. The forests remember. The cycle turns regardless, and at the edge of what remains of the wild, in whatever darkness has not yet been pushed back by the light of a civilization that has decided it does not need the dark, the antlered figure waits, patient as stone, patient as the roots of ancient trees, patient as the cycle itself. That is the dark history of Cernunnos, and it is not finished yet.